Raiding's been one of my favourite parts of World of Warcraft for the longest time. Overcoming the tough bosses, going through progression, and of course getting purple items are all things which WoW has been consistently amazing at over its duration. And when Classic released in 2019, many of us got a chance to go back and experience how raiding began all of those years ago. We got to face bosses which we never could back in the day, or to just see how they were firsthand after having heard so much about them. Because before Classic relived the trilogy of Vanilla, TBC and Wrath for the first time, you certainly heard many stories about raiding back then, mainly surrounding the time investment, the grind, and of course, how difficult things used to be. Some of those remain true, others by today's standards didn't quite hold up so well. As by today, with PCs which can manage above 5 FPS in a raid, all our add-ons and a ton more game knowledge, many bosses fell over pretty easily. But things definitely got more challenging as time went on, all the way from Lucifron in Molten Core to the Lich King himself in his own expansion. And sometimes underestimating an encounter or somebody making a big mistake was all it took to derail the fight, because bosses might have been simple, but they could also be quite punishing as well. So today I'm going to be going over what I felt as though were 10 of the most challenging encounters from the Classic Trilogy of Vanilla, the Burning Crusade and Wrath of the Lich King, and I'll mainly be focusing on how long the fight took to complete back in the day and how difficult it was seen, how did it compare on its re-release, what made it so difficult, and some stats on the fights as well where I can. So all that said, let's make a start. But first a quick word from today's sponsor, Boot.dev. Boot.dev is a platform designed to teach back-end web development from the ground up using the Python and Go programming languages. It turns the learning process into more of an RPG style experience, letting you control the pace of the journey. It has features such as achievements, leaderboards, daily goals and more that you're probably going to be familiar with, which should keep the learning process more engaging as you progress. Above all, Boot.dev focuses on hands-on coding, helping you write and understand your own code. And in my experience, doing things firsthand really is the best way to learn. And though tackling new concepts and principles will be intimidating at first, Boot.dev offers valuable support. It has an AI tool that assists in clarifying what you're learning without simply providing you the answers when you're stuck. And Boot doesn't want a student to feel as though they aren't getting value for their time and money either. So to that end, there is a free demo of every course and its interactive features, and on top of that, a 30 days no questions asked refund policy. So why not give them a try if you're interested? You can go to boot.dev and use my code WILLE to get 25% off your entire first year if you choose the annual plan. Many thanks to boot.dev for the support on the channel. Let's get on back to WoW. Unsurprisingly, there won't be too many additions from Vanilla here, as simply put, a lot of the content from World of Warcraft start was on the simple side. But the first entry I have from Vanilla is the iconic 4 Horsemen encounter. Originally, it was estimated that around 0.1 to 0.2 of the active player base actually cleared Naxxramas in 2006, and you can only imagine back then having the doors open to the end of the military quarter only to be faced with 4 bosses, and what would be a mechanically challenging fight to figure out, as so many people need to be doing different things at the same time. On Naxx's re-release, of course, this was blasted through at record pace by top guilds who had more than just a bit of experience on other servers when it came to this content, but the 4 Horsemen fight could still prove a tricky encounter. The big step up and what makes this fight so infamous is that you need to have 4 very geared tanks and 4 well enough geared off tanks. Typically you need 2 tanks in a raid and some off tanks depending on the fight, so this came as quite the shock. The reason was that each of the bosses needed to be moved to a separate corner at the start of the fight. You might remember in Wrath of the Lich King they ran off to their corners by themselves. They didn't do this in Vanilla. Throughout the fight, everyone close to one of the 4 bosses gained a mark, and these marks stacked. The more marks you have, the more damage they dealt, and these marks became lethal very fast. This means the bosses under no circumstances can be moved once they're in position, and everyone must rotate around the room periodically to ensure their mark stacks from one boss don't become too high. This means making sure enough healers are in range of the tanks, that there's an active tank on the boss, and that there's enough DPS distributed around the room to make sure the bosses are actually dying. Each boss had an ability too. Mograine just slapped the tank about really hard with Righteous Fire. Blammo puts a void zone on the floor, seems easy to dodge, but if it hits you it's more or less going to one-shot you. Korthas summons meteors that do split damage between targets, and Zeliek does some chain lightning hold holy beam type thing, which means you need to be spread. Once you get the rotations down and each person understands what needs doing, it's not too difficult of a fight, but at first there is a lot happening all at once, and if you wipe on a boss in vanilla and lose those world buffs, the next pull of the fight is going to be about 30% harder, and this fight is really easy to wipe on, especially when you're progressing, so that's why I think it deserves a mention here. Next is the second entry from vanilla, and it's going to be the final boss of this version of the game, Kel'Thuzad. In 2006, the world first kill of this boss by Nihilum took place about 2.5 months after the release of this legendary raid, and on its re-release, KT fell about 90 minutes after the raid opened. Times sure change, huh? But that doesn't mean it was a free encounter by any means. In fact, by the end of the second reset during Classic, only 19% of guilds who had defeated at least one boss in Next Rammus had gone on to defeat KT. But if your guild was capable of beating 4 Horsemen and Sapphiron, they could definitely clear Kel'Thuzad. And you know, Ragnaros, Cthulhu and Kel'Thuzad all shared something in common, which made their encounters a bit more complicated than most vanilla bosses, and that was that you are forced to spread your raid out at all times, or disaster would shortly follow. For Ragnaros, it was all about his splash damage and Hand of Rag, Cthulhu of course his iconic I-Beam, and Kel'Thuzad was Mana Detonation, Void Zone and Frost Blast. All the ranged had to be spread around the room to make sure mechanics didn't overlap, and the melee had to be in very tightly stacked groups, as Frost Blast would do more than your maximum percentage health over a few seconds, and it would hit all nearby players, so if you were strafe spamming a bit and hit another group, that could easily be a wipe. The Void Zones would also instantly one-shot you if you moved too slow. The boss would also cast Frostbolt Volley on the whole raid, which if you didn't partially resist would really do a lot of damage. And let's not forget about the mind control effect either. Players had to react fast to CC affected players so they didn't mess up raid positioning or just start one-shotting people themselves. At low health, 2 adds would be called into the room that needed to be tanked until the boss died, but that didn't really add much difficulty to the encounter. The biggest threats on Kel'Thuzad were a bad Frost Blast taking out your melee group, or somebody tanking getting hit by the mind control and you had to react fast before people start getting wiped out. A classic vanilla fight where it's all very simple in theory, but the mechanics that exist are actually very punishing if they go wrong. And yes, there is the first phase, which I'm still trying to mentally block and not mention here, but I guess I have to, and I don't know, I guess somebody thought it showed the endless numbers of the Scourge and the power of the boss, but man was it boring to sit through 5 minutes of trash slowly coming towards you. Either way, Kel'Thuzad was the final boss of vanilla, and he very much earns that title. Next we venture forth from vanilla and on into the Burning Crusade, World of Warcraft's first expansion and a big step up in difficulty when it came to endgame encounters. The first entry from this expansion is going to be Kael'thas, the final boss of Tempest's Keep, also known as the Eye. There was a big difference here between the classic release and how things were in 2007 though, as back then all bosses from tier 4, so Karazhan, Gruul and Magtheridon, tier 5, Tempest's Keep and Serpent Shrine Cavern, and Mount Hyjal, the start of tier 6, were available on the launch of the expansion, so players had an incredible volume of new content to get their teeth stuck into, whereas in Classic the content was split up, so we got tier 4 and then a few months later tier 5 and so on. Because of this, it took 130 days from launch before Kael'thas was finally defeated for the first time, whereas in Classic the boss fell over very shortly post-launch as per usual. However, we did get the pre-nerf version of Kael'thas, whereas it took until after patch 2.1 was released and the opening of the Black Temple before he fell in 2007. What made this fight tough was the learning and getting each part of it correct, from fighting the advisors one by one, taking on their legendary weapons, fighting all the advisors together, and then finally getting onto the proper boss fight. And of course any wipe will lead to a big run back all the way to the boss, as well as having to sit through several minutes of him hyping up his crew all over again. It got old really fast. The boss also focused on spells instead of melee attacks, and allowing any cast to complete or standing in flame strike could be very dangerous, so interrupts and care on your positioning was key. Of course, it wouldn't be a boss in the Burning Crusade if it didn't have some kind of mind control effect, and this one had to be broken by somebody using one of the legendary weapons acquired during the fight. In the final phase, he lifts everyone into the air, and you have to stay spread to not get nuked by his chain lightning attack called Nether Beam, while still interrupting and getting through the last of his health bar. Taking this lengthy fight piece by piece this, it's not too difficult to get down, but it's just putting it all together and executing it correctly where the problems can lie, and just losing the odd person here and there to random damage or mistakes could be enough to spiral a good attempt back into another run back and another few minutes of forced RP. At 7 we have another entry from TBC, and this one comes quite late into the expansion from the Sunwell Muru. This boss above so many others has a famous legacy for its difficulty, and in fact it was the only boss not to be released in a fully pre-nerf state during Classic. In the final phase of this boss it constantly hits the raid with ramping damage, and originally this caused spell knockback, which made casters more or less just not be able to do damage, but this was removed as it was deemed more frustrating than challenging. Originally TBC Muru took 62 days to be defeated, though his release was staggered from launch alongside the Eredar twins and Kill Jaden. It was also this boss which, again back in the day, gave rise to a type of min-maxing which just wasn't as widely appreciated at the time. Players were stacking leatherworking to spam a haste buff via the Drums of Battle item, and this interaction was changed in Classic so you only needed 1 leatherworker per group instead of 4. The challenge here from the encounter was, well, all of it really. For the moment the fight began it felt as though the race was on. The first phase sees packs of ads and Void Sentinels spawn in, which you have to keep on top of before the next set arrive. It's a big DPS race though, as these ads come in at a really fast pace. If you lose people, fall behind on damage, a tank doesn't pick up all the ads, whatever it may be, if something goes wrong, you're gonna wipe. The one thing that could make this encounter way easier on progression though was just bringing more warlocks. There are small ads during the fight that could be subjugated, which could then spam a Shadow Bolt volley for huge damage. I remember coming into this fight one time on my tier 5 geared warlock, and it was only the other warlocks that were doing more damage than me. These ads were really overpowered. But once the boss reaches 0 health for the first time, the second phase starts, and this is where the real race begins, and you have to get the boss's health to 0 before he does the same to you. It was a fun fight and one which I probably could have put higher on the list, but its redeeming features in this regard were no mind control effects for once, a very short run back, and a low level of personal responsibility from most raid members. You just needed to do a lot of healing and damage. Next is my first entry from Wrath of the Lich King, and if we can say that the Burning Crusade was a step up in difficulty, Wrath of the Lich King was a leap up in difficulty. Well, from Ulduar and beyond it was anyway. Tier 7, not so much. But my first pick from Wrath is mmorpg 25 hard mode, aka the infamous Firefighter achievement. Back in the day, Ulduar was hotfixed time and again very early on over concerns of it being crazy overtuned, but we got the pre-nerf version of the raid. Even still, mmorpg hard mode was completed 2 weeks after its launch in 2009 by Insidia, which is really impressive going, to be honest. For us on our re-release, by the end of the second reset, it had just under 600 kills, making it into one of the harder fights in Ulduar. But mmorpg showed who had been paying attention in your raid and who had gotten a little bit too used to standing at the back of the room and casting Fireball, because there was random damage everywhere. Get hit by a shock blast, that's a one-shot, rocket launch, one-shot, frost bomb, one-shot, missile barrage, one-shot, stand in the fire, I mean, not quite one-shot, but it's not going to be very good for you. And the fight was also timed as soon as you press the big red button, where you have 10 minutes to take down the various different parts of the boss. At the end of the encounter, all 3 parts would combine together into Voltron, where the boss would use abilities from each phase of the fight, and it became even more chaotic than it already was. Between the ever-spreading fire and the half-full dozen or so lethal abilities which you needed to track, mmorpg hard mode 25 was not an encounter where you could ever take your foot off the pedal, and every player just had to understand what he did, or you're gonna end up on the floor every single pull. For me, it was definitely one of the better and more challenging bosses of Wrath of the Lich King, and very worthy of a spot on this list. At number 5 is the first entry from Icecrown Citadel, the infamous Professor Putricide encounter. ICC was another raid which was way different back in the day. Not only was each wing released in a staggered fashion, but to even start heroic mode, you had to have defeated the Lich King on normal mode already. We didn't have to deal with either of those in our re-release, but something we did keep were attempts. Between the End of the Wind bosses and the Lich King, you would have 50 attempts total per reset, which put a cap on the number of attempts you had, so you really had to perfect each fight to have as many attempts possible on the harder bosses. Compared to normal mode, Professor Putricide is one of the fights that gets the most changes on heroic, as you have to play out each phase transition with its various oozes. The hardest part comes from raid-wide awareness and of course the dreaded personal responsibility here. The green ooze will root and run to somebody and do split damage, so people will need to stack up with them, and the red one will chase one person. And when you get both of them at once, things get chaotic very fast. Heroic mode also introduced a plague that would deal ramping damage, and it would also leave behind a debuff, meaning the same person can't take it again for a bit, which further complicated positioning. But generally speaking, you just made sure you got it out to a ranged player and have them pass it around for a bit. The final phase was the hardest bit though, as the boss morphed into an abomination which did way more damage. He also applied a debuff to his active tank, and if they ever died, he would heal a massive amount and you'd basically wipe. It could be a tough one to progress on, but it really felt rewarding to get down. Next, we're taking a step back again to the Burning Crusade, and to be honest, the past three between this boss, Professor Putricide and Mimiron are all relatively close together for me, but I think that this was overall the hardest encounter from TBC, and it deserves some respect because of that, and that is Lady Vash. The original world first of the end boss of Serpent Shrine Cavern is shrouded in mystery, with Nihilum claiming it on March 29th, 2007 amidst rumours of bug abuse, whereas Method's famous world first legit kill came a bit over a month later on May 5th. Lady Vash was a very punishing fight, and in my opinion was up there with Muru in terms of the hardest encounters during TBC, but for me it had a few things which made it stand out. The first phase was simple enough really, you just nuke the boss's health down a little bit before phase 2 and the real fight began. Here various ads would spawn in that had to be handled correctly, as well as the iconic tainted core passing from one person to the next before you dunk it in one of the pillars protecting the boss. If you take too long with the core, they could despawn, or you get hit by another mechanic as you're trying to pass them, or it goes to the wrong person and so on. It was a strange and unique mechanic, and they can always be a bit problematic to learn, but if you scored all the cores then you progress with the fight, and here's where things started to get a bit messy. First of all, spore bats will fly into the room and put poison everywhere, and the boss still did her regular mechanics, but biggest of all was the mind control, a mind control effect which was completely removed after patch 2.1 by the way. This would massively buff a player's damage, healing and movement speed, and most dangerously would make them immune to CC effects, so you had to get a tank over to taunt them as soon as possible. This mind control could make or break the fight, as sometimes the boss picked a caster who would proceed to nuke your raid before anyone could do anything about it. The difficulty on Vash was entirely on the last phase, as once things started to go bad, the mind control effect would completely snowball the fight out of control almost instantly, and that for me is why I'm ranking it so high on the list. We're moving into top 3 territory now, and I bet you even have a pretty good idea of the 3 which are going to be left to talk about. First up, we have a trip back to Ulduar, and this time it's for the exclusively hard mode only boss, Algalon the Observer. With the literal fate of the world to be decided on the outcome of this fight, it's kind of a big deal. Back in the day, it took just under 2 months of progression for Insidia to defeat this fight, and after 2 resets during Classic, 119 guilds had claimed a kill. Now to be honest, mechanically Algalon is a pretty straightforward fight, it's just if anything goes a little bit wrong, you wipe. Oh, also, he's hitting your tanks harder than any boss you've ever seen before in the game, and in the first few weeks at least, he could just decide your tank was going to die and there wasn't really much you could do about it. And there's this timer as well, because Blizzard loved putting limited attempts or time restrictions on bosses back then, and for Algalon you get 1 hour per week to progress this fight, and that timer starts the moment you first pull a boss, and that 1 hour goes by really fast when you're progressing. The biggest hurdle on this fight to get correct were the collapsing stars, so several stars would spawn in at once and would gradually lose health. When they died, they would blast the entire raid for massive damage. This meant a player would be in charge of ensuring that they were damaged and died in a staggered fashion, as if you had 2 stars go off too close to one another, it was just unhealable. After progressing the boss to 20% health, phase 2 would begin, and weirdly for Algalon, phase 2 felt completely free, as in when you got there you had a kill, because all the collapsing stars despawned and and they were the problem mechanic in this fight. I think a number of fights I've already talked about were mechanically more challenging than Algalon, but a mix of the 1 hour timer, the crazy tank damage, and how punishing the mechanics were really earning this spot on the list. At number 2 is Yogg-Saron Zero Lights. Now this is a bit of a weird fight because Zero Lights is not technically hard mode. 1 light counts for the hard mode loot, and 1 light is way easier. 0 lights is just for the achievement, the Mimron's head mount guaranteed, and of course the flex. But 0 lights was by far the biggest challenge in Ulduar. Originally it took 85 days to beat, and by the end of the second reset there was 148 kills on Classic servers. So yes, Algalon did have fewer kills on Classic by the end of the second reset, but Yogg-Zero didn't have a 1 hour timer or any attempt limit. You could just bash your head against this boss as much as you wanted to. 0 lights, by the way, simply means no help from any of the keepers that you've rescued during the rest of the raid. So the fight starts as a test to see who can dodge a cloud and who can't. 8 ads need to die for the next phase to start next to the boss. Ads will spawn in by themselves, or if anyone touches a cloud in the room. If you spawn too many ads by accident, it is a wipe, and everyone has wiped to this, believe me. After that, the real boss fight begins, with a team going inside the portals to damage the brain, and others staying outside to deal with tentacles. Good old-fashioned personal responsibility, and splitting the raid always makes the fight harder, and here is no exception. And since we're taking on the 0 lights version of the fight, there was also no way to regain sanity. So if you get hit by mechanics, it's going to drain your sanity, and if you go to 0, you will be permanently mind controlled and have to die, and you can't even get combat res through this either. And sometimes the boss decided you're going insane this pull and just hit you with a targeted ability several times in a row. You can go insane by just getting unlucky on this fight. I've seen it happen a few times, in fact it's happened to me twice. Drain the brain to low health and Yogg's shield will drop, leading to the final phase of the fight, and by far the hardest part of it on 0 lights. Not only can you not restore sanity on 0 lights, but the immortal guardians that spawn in the last phase are immortal. On 1 light, you always get the help of Thorim, who allows these ads to be killed when they reach low health, which makes the final phase pretty easy, to be honest, if you're patient. 0 lights means it's a DPS race, because the ads hit extremely hard and eventually will just kill your tank and then rampage through the entire raid. What complicates this further is the lunatic gaze mechanic. This rapidly drains sanity to anyone who's facing the boss, and during this time most classes can't DPS. Most people need to be facing the boss to do damage. But there is one class and one spec specifically which absolutely excelled during this phase, and that was the Affliction Warlock. Not only was Affliction a top performer the whole way throughout Wrath of the Lich King, but you can continue to drain soul with your back turned, meaning you had close to 0 downtime effectively. Even back in 2009 when the Guild Stars scored their world first kill of this encounter, they were stacking Warlocks back then, and during Classic, again, you pretty much had to stack Warlocks to get a week 1 kill. Most guilds in Classic were taking somewhere between 7 to 9 Warlocks to beat the DPS check. During other fights in Classic, top guilds would class stack because it just makes sense to maximize your DPS. This was the first fight where you had to class stack just to beat it convincingly week 1, and that's why I think it deserves the number 2 spot. I do have an honorable mention before we get to the top spot, because in fact there is a boss that was never beaten pre-nerf in Classic. I guess technically this makes it the hardest boss ever, but it feels a bit weird saying it. Either way, the XT002 Deconstructor was never defeated in a pre-nerf stage during original Wrath of the Lich King or in Classic. This was the second encounter of Ulduar to feature a hard mode, and it was just crazy overtuned. It wasn't a hard fight per se, it was just the boss had so much health that it was mathematically impossible to beat him before he berserked and wiped your raid. Top guilds didn't even get close to killing it, and they did try, by the way. Most guilds didn't even bother, and you didn't need to do XT to reach Algalon either, so really, why put yourself through this? When Blizzard finally got round to nerfing XT, for example on 25 man, his hard mode health was lowered from 47.5 million to 25,200,000. The actual heart itself health was nerfed alongside the ads and his base health. After that, people started doing this fight and realizing it's not too bad, but for a moment we did have an unkillable encounter in Classic, which means at the top spot, and this really shouldn't come as a surprise I don't think, is Lich King 25 Heroic. Arthas is a legendary figure in the WoW universe, and a boss that not only appeared throughout the expansion, but had a whole expansion named after him. You already knew that final showdown with him was going to be a big deal, and this fight was hard. Paragon's first kill took place 46 days after the launch of Heroic, seeing this finish guild's rise to prominence in the WoW scene, a place they would keep throughout most of Kata as well. During Classic, Lich King 25 Heroic fell some mere 94 minutes post-launch by the guild progress. But don't let that fool you, this fight was anything but an easy mode push over Classic boss. Also, Classic saw 61 kills during the first 2 resets, with a pull to kill ratio of 0.5%. Were I covering Kata in this vid as well, Lich King 25 Heroic would still be at the #1 spot, by the way. Memes aside about Classic bosses being easy, this one was definitely extreme week 1, and was the second fight of Wrath of the Lich King that more or less required class stacking to beat. This time around it was all about the Unholy Death Knight, who were great at mitigating damage, dealt amazing bursts during their cooldowns, and were ideal for the ads, as well as the Warlocks again. Here they were just good consistent damage dealers, and absolutely trivialized the Valkyrie mechanic. In a later phase, the Lich King would call down Valkyrie, who would try and throw somebody off the platform. Normally you needed a perfect CC rotation and tons of damage to stop them in time, but Warlocks could get thrown off and then just teleport back onto the platform via Demonic Circle. The difference between a pull where Warlocks didn't get grabbed and when they did was extremely noticeable. There was also the infamous Defile mechanic, where the boss would spawn a pull on top of somebody. You had about 1 second to rocket boost out of this thing before it grew in size and wiped the raid, so even if it just clipped one person, that could be it could be a wipe. Biggest of all for week 1 of the Lich King on 25 Heroic was just how much damage you needed to be doing. If you were getting out of the first phase before the second big ad spawned, you were already doing really well. This fight was also extremely long, with a 15-minute enrage timer, which most people either hit or were extremely close to hitting during their first kill, and each phase presented a number of new challenges that had to be executed perfectly while maintaining very high levels of performance from all members of the raid. In future weeks, ICC gear helped out a lot, and then the raid-wide buff was also introduced, which made the fight much easier, but it still wasn't an entirely free fight, and anyone messing up Defile at any point would always be a wipe. But the loot was so very worth it, and you got Invincible guaranteed as a drop as well, which is a nice little bonus. But there we have it, what for me are 10 of the hardest bosses from the Classic Trilogy. I did want to include a bit of variety between different expansions in a subjective way too, because I think each version of WoW presented different challenges, from the world buffs and organization of vanilla, creating the perfect team comp in TBC and watching your threat, or the more cooldown and mechanics based Wrath of the Lich King. What are your thoughts if you tried any of these bosses, be it back in the day or during Classic? Would you put things in a different order or change the order of bosses round perhaps? Let me know below. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I shall see you on the next one very soon.